Today we're going to talk about economic and budgetary policy. And specifically, I'm going to focus most of this presentation on the goals of economic and budgetary policy. So our political dialogue doesn't do much justice to the importance of budgetary and economic policy. Much of the focus of budgetary policy is about collecting revenue and cutting spending. And these tend to not be the most salient issues among the public, and when it comes to how Democrats and Republicans typically handle revenue and spending, Democrats typically want to create more revenue, a lot of times usually through raising taxes, and Republicans typically want more budget cuts. And then there are certain hot topic or hot button topics within economic and budgetary policy, like Social Security, where it's kind of the third rail of politics, that there are certain social programs that are very popular that neither party really wants to cut in order to help the budget. But these debates often end up political fodder. Deficits specifically end up political fodder because neither party is particularly good at addressing budget deficits. So what I'd like to talk about is the goals of economic policy. What are they? When we talk about the economy and the indicators of whether the economy is doing well, oftentimes people pick certain measures, specific measures. And for those of you who are active on social media and have friends and family that share things about how the economy is doing under President Trump or President Obama or President Bush before that, and oftentimes it depends what numbers you pick. One of these numbers doesn't really capture the entire picture of how the economy is doing and what kind of economic policies actually help. And remembering what the goals of an economic policy are is important because that's going to be how you measure success. Do we have a high unemployment rate that we're trying to decrease? Does a policy help us put people back to work, but then also drive up budget deficits? So in one way, it's doing something successful, and in another way, it's creating another problem. These indicators, these economic indicators, are more complicated than a lot of times we like to think. So let's talk a little bit about what the goals of economic policy are and what some of these indicators are. So first, there's overall gross domestic product growth. So GDP stands for gross domestic product, and this is an increase in the production of goods and services. So typically higher GDPs are good, and GDP growth is good. So that's one indicator people use to decide whether economic policy is working. Another popular one is, of course, the unemployment rate. Generally speaking, having a lot of people unemployed is not good for the economy. So the unemployment rate, or just the number of people unemployed, that's the number of people out of work. Now, this measure is actually more complicated than simply this is the number of people out of work, because you actually have to be searching for work in order to be counted as unemployed. And you can make an extremely small amount of money, say driving for Uber, and technically not be unemployed. So the unemployment rate isn't always a great indicator, isn't totally a great indicator of how many people are actually struggling to find work or enough work, because it doesn't really count the underemployed. People who are working very few hours, therefore are not unemployed, but still not working enough to make ends meet. So measured by the Consumer Price Index, we often look to yearly inflation as part of an economic indicator. Inflation is an increase in the cost of goods and services. Generally, inflation has been pretty low in recent years. There hasn't been a whole lot of inflation. Back in the late 70s, the economy, we suffered from stagflation, so stagnant wages, and rapid inflation, a different kind of economic problem than we face today. Oftentimes we point to a balance in trade. The balance of trade is your imports versus your exports. How much does a nation import compared to how much is exported? We have been typically import heavy in recent decades. There was a time when the United States exported more than they imported, but that has changed for a lot of reasons, not worth getting into in this brief presentation. But as you can see from the chart, we have a greater trade deficit than we have in the past. And economists will argue whether or not that's important, and if so, how much, how important is it? There's also the federal debt, so the national debt. The national debt, as you can see, has gone up, and the red is Republican presidents and the blue is Democratic presidents, and this graph does not actually go far enough to get to President Trump's term. But as you can see, we've had a federal debt problem, a steady increase in the federal debt, which is a little bit different than, so the debt is different from budget deficits. So the debt is the overall number, how much debt is the national government in. The deficit is a year-to-year number that shows here's how much more debt we're going to be adding. So when politicians say that they're cutting the budget deficit, it doesn't necessarily mean that the debt is going down. Unless you have a budget surplus, that's not going to happen. It means that we're adding less to the overall national debt. So if we're running a budget deficit in 2011 of over $1 trillion, we're adding $1 trillion to the federal debt in that year. If we're running a budget deficit of $400 billion, say in 2015, then we're adding $400 billion to the deficit. So, to the debt. So bringing down deficits is a little bit different from the overall national debt. But we look to these things to decide whether economic policy is successful. Another common indicator is stock market success. So, what does the Dow Jones look like? What's the value? Record stock numbers. Again, the stock market being healthy is a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily capture everything about whether economic policy is successful. Oh. So what I want you to think about in this chapter is the different goals of economic policy and how economic policies, the success of economic policies, can be measured in different ways. And basically, I'd say the takeaway point from this presentation really is that we have a lot of different indicators for how the economy is doing. And I didn't even include some of them, like income inequality or home ownership. Home ownership is a number that sometimes is pointed to indicate whether the economy is doing well. None of these numbers alone really capture the entire story of how the economy is doing at any given time. But we have a tendency to look towards certain numbers to have some kind of indication of whether economic policies are successful or not.